like I said, we are covering over a little bit more with regards to some of the areas of the mind of persuasion. And to some extent, this is where we always should be starting. Anytime you're evaluating persuasive tactics in terms of the area of thinking about thinking in this case. So through interpersonal communication, we have our own intrapersonal battles determining our own right from wrong. So when we're communicating, much like I mentioned last class with theory of planned behavior, when we're communicating with each other, we have our interpersonal conversations. However, we're thinking intrapersonally as these conversations come to fruition, as we're trying to go through decision-making processes. And, there's a lot of different theories that we'll be talking about within this video specifically that talks about this notion of how do I feel when I know a persuasive tactic is being used on me right now. So, but first, before we get into it, we got to think about how much do we think. And so this goes back into our area of availability heuristics in terms of how much we assess things based on actual logic versus programming, or again, availability heuristics. Because again, a lot of what we're talking about here is that we have stored responses. These are what are called scripts. We have stored responses to practically most situations. So if a situation presents itself, we have this automated response about how we're supposed to feel about something. And that's within reason, right? Because first and foremost, a lot of this will come from our nurture of how we were raised, our own personal experiences. And then from that, how much do we adapt from there? So, it's really eerie how similar that we are to something like a robot in this case in terms of how we're programming. In fact, there's a really good book called Love, Sex, and Robots that talks about kind of how we plan to communicate with these technologies in the future. But the premise of one of the things they mentioned in that book is how similar we are in terms of kind of automated responses that we have. So like if someone comes up to you and says, hey, what's up? And you would respond, not much, you. There are certain responses that we have that are just, again, we really don't even have to think about them in this case. So, how much do we actually think for an individual circumstances versus a random response? So it can be, if someone's feeling upset about something and they're trying to talk with you about it, you can really listen to what's being said. You can cognitively process each word, think about empathy, what would be appropriate word versus not appropriate, or you could just say, well, that sucks, or I've been there, or, I hope things get better. Again, automated responses here. So that's what starts that click whir that Cialdini always talks about, that fixed action patterns. And so there's a couple of things that we could talk about that. So what starts everything that we know? So this isn't just, these automated responses. They're the automated responses that begin things like beliefs, attitudes, social comparison, salience, values, that kind of thing. So let's talk about a couple of those first. So first we get into beliefs. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Dogma before, and you can kind of weigh whether you think that movie is appropriate or not in terms of, I know friends that say it's very sacrilegious, but there's a scene in it that really caught my ear from a persuasion aspect of when the main character talks to another character and says, is there anything wrong with having beliefs? And the character responded by saying, I just think it's better to have ideas. You can change an idea, but beliefs are extremely tricky. People fight for them. People die for them. These beliefs are very strong and embedded, and it is our inherent sense of what is right or wrong, true and false. So again, this plays a lot of weight. This is why beliefs are really tricky to change, because they're so embedded with the fact that they're embedded with our truth, or the sense of right in this case. So if we've got that mentality that something is right or it is true, it's hard to change that unless we have basically almost like a pickaxe knocking at each logical point as you're going along, to where you sit there and say, maybe this isn't the best idea for what I'm looking at right now. So, beliefs doesn't, it always is usually associated with religion, but it doesn't inherently have to be a religious viewpoint. You can believe in a lot of different things. But again, that belief structure is very hard to be able to maneuver around because it is so strong and embedded. The interesting thing about this, when you're delivering a persuasive message when it comes to beliefs, is that the interest in the area of listening are usually pretty high when you're trying to persuade beliefs, particularly when people are really invested in it, because people are really invested in it. So if you try to offer a counterpoint towards somebody's beliefs, you can expect them to listen. However, one thing we'll talk about here gets into social judgment theory, which we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow, of this latitude of acceptance or rejection. So, you can have people stay that much firmer in that latitude of acceptance, or they can go in the opposite direction where you can argue it's a boomerang effect. I don't know if I necessarily really get into that argument, but usually they just stay that much further in and stay stronger in that latitude of rejection in this case. So those are beliefs. Attitudes are a bit easier. They're knowledge structures or schemas, so things that we know about. And we learn many attitudes towards things, which can be also difficult to break, because anytime we're introduced with the subject, we kind of first go through our stimulus process of say, what do I think about something? And it doesn't inherently need to be beliefs in this case. It can be something a little less strong, but at the same time, something you're very interested in. I said very about 3 times just there. And I'm seeing this a lot in terms of politics in the Winter Olympics now, of certain athletes speaking up and audience members not liking that they're speaking up. The attitudes towards respect towards the presidency can be very strong with some people, and so when people go against that, again, those attitudes are extremely strong. They don't inherently have to be beliefs, because this is right and wrong, true and false, but again, those attitudes of the what you feel in this case can be pretty strong as well. It's usually one of the least strong of beliefs, attitudes, and values. Values are ideals that construct our lives. I just used the same word to define it. They're ideals that kind of construct our lives, and they're usually stable and pretty applicable. So, you might have the value of every person deserves a good education, or you might have the value of a hard day's work, or you may have the value of family first. And they're really axioms and maxims and colloquialisms that we base so much on, and they shape a lot of how we do things. They're not, again, inherently beliefs, they're not inherently attitudes, but we do assess these values in terms of when things come up. My parents, for instance, have a very strong value system towards certain holidays and how you should react and how you should behave and how you should be doing things leading up to it. So they always want everything perfect to them. And that presence, that display of showing your best foot forward is a value system that they have. Other things we can look at is salience. So which one of these attitudes or beliefs or values are most important to you? Because if you think about it, anytime that you're assessing a value, an attitude, or a belief in this case, you've got to think of which one is most applicable and which one's going to carry the most weight. Because sometimes we have topics that we get into that we really do not care about. I have my personal areas that I don't like to hear certain conversations, or I tend to move away from them because they just don't really interest me. And so that salience comes into play here. But the interesting thing with salience in this case is if someone's talking to me and given a certain topic, they could be easily persuading me if they can catch my interest. This is the problem that is on the opposite side of beliefs. Beliefs I will listen to, but I'm going to have a strong opinion to. Whereas in salience in this case, we may need to feed into my availability heuristics, and you may not catch my attention. However, if you do, I might be easier to persuade in this case. The last thing within these starters of availability heuristics, are modeling or social comparison. So more often than not, we do compare our behaviors and adjust towards other things we see. So we emulate those we admire versus turning away from those we do not. So if we see an action that we deem admirable, respectful, full of virtue, we sit there and say, I want to react accordingly to model after that person in terms of whatever it is they did. So, if they donated, if it's a celebrity and they donated to charity, I want to do that. If it's a celebrity and they gave back, or I just said donate to a charity, but as one of my wife's best friends calls courtesy points in sports. So if you help a fellow athlete up after they fell down, or showed good sportsmanship, that may be that area of social comparison that I want to emulate in this case. Whereas if I say things that are rude, not virtuous, of poor taste, then I'm going to stay away from that, and I'm going to make sure that I model in the exact opposite way. So one of my kind of guilty pleasure shows, I don't even know if it's on the air anymore. I used to watch Wife Swap a lot. And the reason I watched it kind of in uses of gratification, because I'd always model myself after people I respected on the show, which weren't many people, by the way, versus people that I saw as, lazy, apathetic, and I didn't want to be those people. So I went in the opposite direction, and usually my wife would say I was a better husband for watching that show because the house was always clean after I watched it. So there's a couple things that I want to talk about as kind of the last area, but it will take a little bit to cover over, are some of these models of persuasion. And your book in Denton covers it, and I want to go over them in short succession, only because I'm going to go over a bunch of them in greater detail. So things that may have already come up, things like stimulus response theory. Stimulus response theory comes up in terms of what we know about Ivan Pavlov's dog. You've probably heard of Pavlov and classical conditioning of, introducing a phenomena, which in this case was a bell and dog food. And so he would train the dogs that every time you ring the bell, the dog would go towards the food in this case, and they would start salivating. So his goal was, if I ring the bell, I can get a dog to salivate without showing that dog food. So that's kind of the premise behind it. But there are certain things that come up that come into what is stimulus response theory. My mother, for instance, used to do this with our dogs, where she would scold our dog for jumping up on a piece of furniture, and then other times she wouldn't. And I'm thinking, from a stimulus response theory perspective, that's confusing. And it could be the same in terms of raising a child, in terms of punishing versus rewarding, given the same type of behavior. So if it's not consistent, Pavlov would say that's confusing towards that person, and they might not understand what they're being rewarded for versus not. So that's one. The next is inoculation theory, which looks into kind of predicting future messages. A lot of this will have to do with media in terms of what you are being shown at any given point in time. Because like I said, when we have our beliefs, attitudes, values, we'll always have those whenever we see a persuasive message. But I mentioned in one of them, sometimes you go in with a pickaxe and start hitting the rocks that form your attitudes, and bit by bit we're chipping little parts off. And so with inoculation, when you're showing that conversing message, it's often or not, unless you're kind of in a complete selective exposure, that you'll start to at least think of it in a different way. And that's kind of where some of that theory comes in. But that's hard. And this is where the next one comes in, which is my personal favorite theory of communication, or, well, not communication, but persuasion, is cognitive dissonance. And I'll go more into detail with this, but suffice to say, the old parable is a fox wanted some grapes on a tree and noticed that the tree was too high hanging. He couldn't get the grapes, so he had to decide that he didn't really need the grapes after all. So he had to make a decision processing here to say, okay, I have two conflicting thoughts going on. I have to settle on one to achieve consonance, because otherwise I'm going to say in dissonance and I'm just going to be confused. So that's where inoculation actually works really well with cognitive dissonance, because if we see a competing persuasive attempt versus what we're used to in values, attitudes, or beliefs, then we sit there and say, well, I don't know what I believe in right now. Or I still believe this, but, I'm having trouble with this particular area. You can think of a dozen topics that might come into this. Another one is attribution theory. I'm not going to go too far into this, but the audience usually considers a source motives when judging the importance. So if, say, word of mouth communication, for instance, it's one of the oldest ways of advertising. If I think about the source motives of the persuasive attempt, so they're telling me you really need to go to this restaurant. If I know your motive is that you work at said restaurant, then I'm going to think that this is just an advertisement that you're trying to get me to go there as an employee, rather than someone who genuinely likes this, versus someone who does genuinely like this. I might be more inclined to listen to them. The next three deal with what are called dual processing. So dual processing means that when I listen to a persuasive message, I'm going to fall on this latitude range. So they're usually, rejection or acceptance in some regard. Not all of them, but a rejection and an acceptance that when a persuasive message is delivered to me, I'm going to go in one of these two directions or be in the middle ground in this case. But, I may strongly disagree with what you're saying, or I might only slightly disagree. So this is where the boomerang effect comes in. So we have an intended goal when we try to persuade people. So I can think of one example for the Above the Influence campaign, which dealt with an anti-marijuana-based public service announcement. And their intended goal was to try to get adolescents off using marijuana as a recreational drug. And what ended up happening was an unintended outcome, where in a particular study I read about this, it mentioned that not only did it not work in terms of trying to reach its intended goal, it actually went in the opposite direction, where people wanted to try marijuana more in this case. So, which is obviously a bit of a problem in their circumstance, that they don't want people to be doing this, and yet that's what happened. Whereas social judgment, in this case, is another theory, and this is actually one that I kind of fall more into, is when we start to fall in these latitudes of rejection and acceptance. Did I do that right? Anyway, where it's kind of a retroactive thing. So you may say, I enjoy something because I'm good at it, or I'm doing it, so I guess I enjoy it to some regard. I have that relationship with my love for flags. That could be Sheldon Cooper's presents Sheldon Cooper's Fun with Flags. My dual processing says, if I like country flags of the world, I would say yes, but I'm really not sure why. I don't know really what it sparked me to really be invested in it. I'm just good at it in this case. So that's why I always have flags. I've got my stand right here. If I can pull it out, maybe I can't. There we go. So my little state flags is, again, something that's always interested me to some regard. But that's kind of a stupid situation of talking, whether you enjoy flags or not, kind of dumb in this case. However, a good latitude of rejection or acceptance could go back to the Above the Influence campaign, where it's not inherently that I'm moving in the opposite direction of rejection, but that I'm just staying more firm in those areas. This is what social judgment talks a little bit more in this case, is that I'm more firm in this area versus actually moving in another direction. So it just strengthens within that latitude of rejection. The last one is the elaboration likelihood model. I'll cover over that in a later week. It's basically how we process message, whether it's we pay attention to the fine print or we pay attention to the jingle. I'll get more into it, but there's a good example on page 150 of your Woodward and Denton book. I'd strongly encourage you to look at it because, some of it will actually talk about the ability to process some of this material versus our desire to process some of this information. So that all comes into play. So like I said, all these things deal with our individual beliefs, and that's why, I talked a little bit about it with theory of reasoned action, theory of planned behavior. Tomorrow, I believe I'm talking about social judgment theory, which extends a little bit more into what we've been talking about with this particular area of, again, bridging that gap between what we perceive cognitively and how we work socially in this case. So that's it for today. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Keep dry. I think it's supposed to rain all week. But and stay well, okay? I just noticed so many of my students and myself have gotten sick lately. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow. Okay, thanks. Bye.